Okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to present to you a very interesting result of the study that we did in Latin America. So we know that we need transformative actions, and we know that in order to transform food systems, there are a lot of things that we need to do. And we have also discussed the importance of policies and institutions to enable that environment so that we can implement those actions at the scale that we need. So back in Cali, in Colombia, we were wondering, so are we ready in the region? Are our policies ready in the region to enable us to implement those transformative actions, or do we need to start from zero? So we try to answer that question. I don't know how this works. Yeah. Using the 8 elements for transforming food systems under a changing climate that Bruce and other scientists proposed in a paper back in 2018. And using those elements and text mining techniques plus in-depth policy analysis of 43 climate-related policy documents in Latin America from 17 different countries, we found that 2 of the elements that were very relevant in those documents, policy documents in the region, were climate-informed advisory services and pathways for change. So we said, okay, this is interesting, but let's look a little bit deeper. So what we did was to select a sample of 8 countries in order to see, okay, so they are mentioning this in the policies, but to what extent they are really proposing things in the, proposing actions in their policies to address those 8 elements. So what we found was that, for example, local organizations and networking, the one related to climate-informed services, partnerships and capacity building, and also credit and insurance were those elements that were present in the climate-related policies, but also were actually addressed as it was defined in this paper on transforming food systems under a changing climate. We also found that, for example, the work with private sector and public partnerships was not that addressed within the policies that we have in Latin America. So that was very interesting because we are talking about NDCs and plans and strategies for adaptation and mitigation that we need to have private sector really involved. And the big missing element was digital agriculture. So those topics related to digital agriculture are not at all included in our policies in the region. So based on this analysis, what we said, okay, so we are answering our question. So there is no need to start from zero in Latin America. So we have some policies, and we have policies related to climate change that are addressing some of the elements proposed for transforming food systems. However, we need to level up some of those elements. So we need to understand really how, in our policies, we can enable the environment to implement some of these actions that are going to really transform the way that we have addressed food systems in a changing climate. And we need to pay special attention to digital agriculture because there are a lot of opportunities there, but we need the alignment with the climate policy agenda so that we really try to use ICTs and all these innovations in order to implement transformative actions in our region. Thank you very much.
It's It's great, actually, that we've been touching upon the point of digitalization and the need of good policies, for example. So actually, one of the things that we wondered when starting a project that is on digitalization of extension services in Rwanda is, are they ready? And who did we mean by they? Well, those are farmers, specifically banana farmers, as well as village-level extension agents who are active in banana villages in Rwanda. And we asked ourselves this question because as so many different projects who are moving into digital agriculture, we have very high expectations. And I think in many cases, these interventions have the expectation that already smartphones are trickling into the villages. And if not today, they will be accessible to the majority tomorrow. The truth is perhaps a little bit more complex. And so our results, which is based on 2 different baseline studies from 138 villages in 8 different districts in Rwanda, with 138 village extension agents and nearly 700 farmers, shows that today about 3% of both extension agents and farmers has a smartphone. On the other hand, the vast majority is accessing basic phones, but still about 30% of the female farmers doesn't have ownership over a phone at all. And so that draws a slightly more nuanced picture of where we stand today and what is possible with digital extension services if you target these services that are a bit more fancy, that require, for example, applications or pictures, or that require eventually internet connectivity. At the same time, we also saw that, for example, internet use is almost negligible. And we did see a digital divide, so about 10% of the male farmers and male extension agents had access to internet, but for females, this was almost out of the picture. So where do people get their information from instead? Well, that's highly localized. So we specifically looked at how information is being exchanged regarding banana diseases, because that's the particular objective of this project. The project is hoping to actually reduce the pressure of the banana disease in Rwanda, which is really threatening livelihoods and food security. So where do people get their information from, and how does information spread? Well, that's all locally. So it means people get their information from village leaders, from other farmers, and from radio. So one of these sort of old-fashioned technologies that maybe aren't so sexy, but still very important. And at the same time, and that's another thing that is sort of concerning and makes, again, sort of a case why we would like to move into digitalization and why we're also very enthusiastic about it, is that still about 50% of the farmers doesn't get information about banana at all. And why does this all matter? Well, I think what I'd like to sort of express with this is that, yes, we need to be very enthusiastic and very eager to adopt digital technologies, but at the same time, I think it's necessary to have some sort of realistic picture of what is to be expected at a village level today. Because even though technologies are not, at a standstill, they're continuously progressing, the village level accessibility and capacity of people to actually use these technologies is not necessarily tagging along. And at the same time, we do see a challenge of knowledge not reaching everyone. So that makes the case to definitely try and breach the gap between the digital world and all that's possible with technologies and how we can reach everyone, as well as this gap in knowledge exchange and this very localized level. Why? Because for as long as it's only at a local basis, it makes it really difficult for us to have an overview. And for example, in the case of diseases, this is something that would be necessary because governments want to interact at the moment when it's most needed. They want to implement interventions when it's most pressing, but they usually are in blue, they don't know. And So what I would like to end with is actually a question. What, as researchers, as NGOs, as organizations are working with farmers or studying digital tools, can we do to bridge this mismatch between what we expect from digital technologies and what is actually realistic to be happening today at a field level and to make it beneficial for the majority?
Thanks, Mariette.
So good afternoon. Now I'm moving from global to local. And I would like to start by saying that if we go back to when the CSA concept emerged, I think we can all say that the journey has been quite useful and successful in several ways. The CSA concept has proven to be a very powerful organizing principle to help reflect this ambition we have to integrate better agricultural development and climate responsiveness. It has also helped us to place agriculture into the international climate negotiations, and it has helped mobilize a coalition of organizations and institutions that are aiming to promote and finance scaling of CSA. However, one of the important gaps that stands on the way if we want to promote the scaling of these technologies is that if we want to prioritize and program this scaling, in most of the cases we only have access to empirical assessments and expert consultations. There is a real gap of direct observations and monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of these technologies in the field and which is the outcomes that they are specifically achieving in different contexts. So to help solve, or at least progress in this gap, we have designed an integrated CSA framework to support teams in the field to measure and track progress in the adoption of CSA practices and technologies, but also in progress in terms of accessing climate information services, and then look at how the access to these technologies is having an outcome at household and then also at farm level. So this framework actually proposes first a set of standard indicators to look at the progress across 5 enabling dimensions that might affect adoption patterns. And then it also proposes 5 core indicators to look at how the responses are in terms of outcomes at household level in food security, productivity, income, climate vulnerability, but also across 4 gender-specific indicators. Then, at farm level, we're proposing 7 core indicators to look at farm performance and synergies and trade-offs across the 3 pillars. And we have coupled this framework to a cost-effective data collection tool that we call GeoFarmer that basically allows to capture data in almost real time. So this app basically is holding a questionnaire structured around thematic modules where all the questions are interlinked and connected with specific indicators. Then, depending on the user's need, we might need to use all or only part of those modules. This tool, actually, the combination of the framework and the app, has been now tailored, calibrated, and validated across 9 different countries with very diverse settings and systems, with the support and patience of the CICAF team in the regions, the local partners, and the farmers themselves. Now, I'd like just to illustrate with data collected in the Ghana Climate Smart Village how the systematic application of this framework can allow us to respond to 4 questions. First, who adopts what within a community? Which typologies of households might exist in this community and what they are adopting? Which are the main adoption drivers? Then, which are the perceived CSA outcomes or responses at household levels in terms of food security and livelihood security, and adaptive capacity. Then how the implementation of the different practices is having or not an effect across 4 gender aspects. And finally, which is the farm performance and which are the synergies and trade-offs between the different pillars. Something that is interestingly highlighted in these results is not only the existence of these synergies and trade-offs among the pillars, but also the fact that often when you have farms that are actually adopting similar combinations of practices, despite this, the response might be pretty different. So just to finish, I'd like to say that although this work has been developed in the context of the Climate Smart Village work of CCAFs, we expect that it will support implementation in the field of a broad range of partners. Thank you very much.
Wow, those are 3 amazing talks. What I'm doing follows on a little bit from what Osana was talking about. She mentioned trade-offs and synergies at the farm level between pillars, but I'm going to be talking to you about trade-offs and synergies within CSA pillars for practices. So I'm talking about practice bundles, and so why are we interested in those? Well, farmers rarely practice technologies on their own. They practice them in combinations. And there's a large demand from a diverse variety of stakeholders for effective portfolios or combinations or bundles of practices that deliver enhancements to multiple CSA pillars at the same time. So we used the Enhancing Resilient Agriculture database, a fantastic resource from Africa, compiling the results of thousands of studies into climate-smart agriculture. And we used this database and created tools to analyze the studies within it to provide evidence for the outcome performance of these practice bundles. So a famous Greek philosopher, Aristotle, once said, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So is this true for climate-smart agriculture practices? So we took studies that had a combination of 2 practices compared to a control, and its component practices as well on their own compared to a control, and developed a typology to classify these so we could understand what was happening. And this gives us 4 typology categories. So the worst result is when your combination practice is rubbish and it performs worse than either of its component practices. The next result is, it's not a good result as well. Your combination of doing 2 things together was no better than the best of its component practices, but no worse than the worst of those 2 things. Next is, this is a good outcome, it's additive. That should say subadditive. It's where your combination is better than the best of your practices, but it's still not greater than the sum of, the whole is still not greater than the sum of its parts. That's a super additive in yellow. That's where doing your 2 practices together deliver an outcome that's greater than the sum of those 2 component practices. So I'm going to give you a high-level outcome from the sort of types of analysis that we've been doing with the ERA database. So this is looking at data aggregated up to the productivity and resilience pillars. And what surprised me is that only a quarter of the time are we finding a synergistic outcome for productivity outcomes. That's the yellow slice of the pie. And in resilience outcomes, we're seeing this about a third of the time. If we add in the subadditive outcomes for bundling, then this is a slightly better situation. We're seeing good outcomes at just over 50% of the time. But the flip side of that is, if you look at the blue, we're seeing no benefit of adding 2 practices together 30% of the time, and even worse, the purple there, 14 to 20% of the time, we're seeing an antagonism where doing those 2 practices is actually worse than doing one of them alone. So Aristotle is disappointed. What might be driving this? Well, these are possibly real results. So doing these 2 practices together was a bad idea, and this may relate to the context specificity of climate-smart agriculture. There may be trade-offs between outcome pillars, and we're developing the methods and tools to look at this. And we might not be looking at the whole. So practice combinations or bundles are often complicated and include more than 2 practices. Now, we can also look at that using the ERA database. We can take the more complicated bundles and compare them to a single CSA practice. There's a lot of data for this, but they don't involve a control. So we can only look at the sort of relative improvement to a CSA practice when we add more practices to this focal practice. So it's like a sort of relative improvement. So here we're taking a focal practice of improved varieties. We can add inorganic fertilizer or agroforestry. We could add crop rotation. We could add all of those things and reduce tillage. And we can just use this to make simple graphs that sort of visualize this data. So don't worry about what the text says in the little writing there. The point of this is that we can do this for a number of different practices and look at the evidence for how adding practices to this focal practice might increase its performance. So in this case, the most successful outcome was adding agroforestry and an organic fertilizer to improve varieties. So I guess my simple take-home messages from this are bundling practices didn't lead to the benefits that we expected, especially when you consider that scientists should have an a priori reason for combining 2 things to lead to a positive outcome. We were seeing a positive outcome barely more than 50% of the time. So really do think about which practices you're adding together and the context in which we're doing it. Secondly, we have the data, the database, and the tools to analyze practice bundle outcomes for multiple pillars. So the tyranny of the single practice is over. And I just want to mention one last thing, which is we're going to be launching the ERA database this afternoon at 5 p.m. in the Hibiscus Room. Please come along. It's going to be fun. There's going to be games and prizes. So, okay, thanks.